Colonel North, in your work at the NSC, were you not assigned at one time to work on plans for the continuity of government in the event of a major disaster? Mr. Chairman.
I believe that question touches upon a highly sensitive and classified area, so may I request that you not touch upon that, sir.
I was particularly concerned, Mr. Chairman, because I read in Miami papers and several others that there had been a plan developed by that same agency, a contingency plan in the event of emergency that would suspend the American Constitution. And I was deeply concerned about it and wondered if that was the area in which he had worked. I believe that it was.
I most respectfully request that that matter not be touched upon at this stage. If we wish to get into this, I'm certain arrangements can be made for an executive session.
Here is not justified. Many of us were told in private conversations that if we voted against this bill on Monday, that the sky would fall, the market would drop 2,000 or 3,000 points the first day, another couple thousand the second day, and a few members were even told that there would be martial law in America if we voted no. That's what I call fear-mongering. Unjustified. Proven wrong. We've got a week, we've got 2 weeks to write a good bill. The only way to pass the bad bill, keep the panic pressure on.
For a plan that provides for the cooperation, the coordination, and continued functioning of all 3 branches of the government. The Bush administration tells us they have such a plan. They introduced a little sketchy public version that's clearly inadequate and doesn't really tell us what they have in mind. But they said, don't worry, there's a detailed classified version. But now they've denied the entire Homeland Security Committee of the United States House of Representatives access to their so-called detailed plan to provide for continuity of government. They say, trust us. Trust us, the people who brought us Katrina, to be competent in face of a disaster. Trust us, the people who brought us warrantless wiretapping and other excesses eroding our civil liberties. Trust us. Maybe the plan just really doesn't exist, and that's why they won't show it to us. I don't know. Or maybe there's something there that's outrageous. The American people need their elected representatives to review this plan for the continuity of government. Gentleman's time has expired. Go up.
When the world's about to end, Kansas is probably the last place you think you'd go. However, if you want to hunker down in a bunker, Survival Condo is where you want to be. And once you step inside those doors, well, you're not in Kansas anymore.
Years ago, Larry Hall purchased an old missile silo and turned it into a lavish complex for the wealthy to worry about doomsday. Each condo is fit for an entire family to live like they do in the real world.
The unthinkable has already been thought through here.
The federal government's ready for the moment of disaster. As mushroom clouds plume, key politicians and federal staffers would be rushed underground. The sites are prepared, humming along with daily activity right now and hidden from the public. If you're invited, you already know it. If not, you're sort of on your own. Some new facilities have been built up over the last few years, and Garrett Graff found one by accident.
Underground bunkers and panic rooms aren't just for extreme preppers anymore. Several companies that specialize in building these upscale doomsday retreats say business is booming. We went inside a Southland home with all the security bells and whistles.
During the height of the Cold War, the United States began its largest underground construction project, Cheyenne Mountain. In conjunction with Canada, the bilateral agreement gave NORAD the green light to build the superstructure in the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains. Construction was finished shortly before the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the need for Cheyenne Mountain became glaringly apparent.
We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founders.
In today's video, I would like to discuss continuity of government, or COG. But to fully understand what continuity of government is today, I am going to give an entire history lesson from my perspective of research on where continuity of government came from, how COG evolved over time and technology, and some very interesting stories. I will be citing information from the National Archives of the United States of America, from books written by Garrett Graff, from declassified information of the bunkers we know of and stories we know of COG. And all this information is sourced. None of it is speculation or conspiracy theory. I'd like to start back to the end of World War II, the war that America joined in and helped win, but we weren't directly a part of. Pearl Harbor happened to us on US soil, but it was set up in a way where losses would not be that bad, as the US military knew about it. But America never felt the bombings, never felt the Dresden events, never felt what it was like to be under full-scale war. So after World War II, the presidency was a very slow agency. It wasn't as quick as it was today. Back then, for example, as late as 1935, when FDR was done dedicating the Hoover Dam, the president's motorcade was lost in the canyon roads for the entire afternoon, and nobody cared. Nobody knew where they were, how long they were going to be, or when they would return. As late as 1945, when Truman was VP, he didn't have any Secret Service protection. He walked around DC leisurely, did as he would, whenever he wanted. As long as he could be reached within an afternoon or he got back to people by the next morning, wasn't considered missing, everything was fine. A very different world back then. Then nukes were invented. Nuclear bombs. And with the invention of the nuclear bomb came the idea to the US government to put into play relocation sites, evacuation plans to save the government, and mitigation for the end of America, and to prevent a total loss of the American way. This is where continuity of government started. And the entire modern world we live in today is a byproduct of COG, of their endgame protection plan for their government. Various technologies have spawned from their research, development, and foregoing of COG policy. For example, the internet. The very first ever chat program was called Emissary, originally used for bunker-to-bunker communications to discuss ration supplies and stock supplies and information exchange. The airplane reservation systems that you use today, like Orbitz or other popular airplane reservation systems, is a descendant from COG original technology known as Sabre to track Soviet bombers coming in to bomb America. Eisenhower's interstate and defense highway system, designed by him and implicated, that you drive on every day to go on vacation, some of you to go to work, was designed for this reason over time, for the defense of American cities, for evacuation plans, and for the military. The highways and interstate systems of America are not only used for travel, but the military can use them to drive tanks on because they're wide enough. You can land planes on them because they are smooth enough and flat enough. You could use them to cut off regions of the country in terms of a mass invasion. And even some of these policies took a less physical form, like the highways. During the Johnson-Nixon era, the USS Northampton and the USS Wright were used as mobile command centers, or mobile White Houses, that the president would retreat to and hide on the open ocean in the event of attack. and to command the nation. But as the invention of satellite technology got greater and you couldn't hide a ship anymore, they scrapped that plan and moved it to what we have today. We even had airborne command posts in the 1960s, codenamed Operation Looking Glass, which would serve as the nation's absolute last line of defense. And it flew from 1962 to the 1990s, 24-hour a day, 7 days a week, always with a one-star general on board in the continuity of government. In the event that the ground surface was wiped out, all of command was wiped out on the ground, this last general would take command to give orders to the nuclear submarines to launch their final missiles. Nowadays, we have continuity of government planes, or the doomsday planes. We all know about it. From 9/11, they were flying over 9/11 in the white doomsday planes. Today, that's called Operation Night Watch, and those are airborne command posts. And one of these airborne White Houses are sitting on the runway of Offutt Air Force Base with the engines always running 24/7, and within a 15 minutes notice can be airborne to give commands to the nation's army at any given time. These are the COG planes. We had a whole entire fleet of Gulfstream jets that would follow Air Force One and land at adjacent airports all around where Air Force One would land. And all those pilots were trained to be able to land at the secret landing strip at Mount Weather. And in the event that something happened, the president wouldn't go back to Air Force One. He would be evacuated to one of these other planes that would evacuate him to Mount Weather. Many of you went to schools that were built before or during the Cold War. And many of these schools had fallout shelters underneath them. You saw in the hallways little placards that said, "Fallout shelter down here, fallout shelter." These fallout shelters are a direct byproduct of COG planning, where they would try to save a majority of the populace in fallout shelters in cities, under courthouses, under schools. But that was pretty futile, as the planning only went so far, and they left it up to localities to stock the bunkers with food and water. The only thing the government provided was 170,000 tons of survival biscuits. They partnered with Nabisco, and they made a huge quantity of these very unsavory, horribly dense and unflavored biscuits that you could survive off of. They had fat in them, they were fortified with nutrition, and they were stored in tins across bunkers for the military and the public fallout shelters around the nation. And they were so bad and unused that we eventually sent them for relief in Zimbabwe and other African nations during relief efforts over the years. And hopefully they enjoyed them more than our military or our citizens. But as technology speeds up, as the response time for these events shortened, in the beginning it was a 12 to 14 hour response time. You'd be able to warn the public to get to the fallout shelters, to gather your families. You'd be able to have more government involved. You could save the whole Congress, whereas now modern day COG has no room for Congress. We'll talk about that later. In the beginning, Russia had to send planes over to drop the bombs. That's where the response time came from. With the invention of ballistic missiles, ICBMs, the response time shortened to much shorter. And that's when the government started leaving out the populace in the COG, and they just started focusing on the shadow government, a complete backup copy government that is operating and waiting in the event of destruction, waiting in the bunkers, waiting underground. And throughout the years, there's been different flavors and memes of COG. During the Bush era, it was completely about all the contracts to Halliburton, making them money, making all the people that ran it vast sums of money. and putting them into direct power, and bringing some of the COG laws to the surface level, like the Patriot Act. Whereas the COG of Hoover and the old FBI incorporated FBI lists that if a nuclear event took place, in those 12 hours of prep when the bombs were coming, they would round up all political dissidents and everybody on Hoover's little blacklist and gulag them before going into the bunkers. Very scary stuff. Let's talk now about some of the bunkers around the nation. I've done a video about deep underground military bases, but this is a little different. I want to show you publicly known declassified bunkers that are still used today, and many of these you've heard of and many you haven't. Of course, you've heard of Raven Rock, which is the backup Pentagon in Waynesboro, Pennsylvania. It's a hollowed out mountain with freestanding buildings inside, an actual entire built city of freestanding buildings. And these freestanding buildings are 2 to 3 story buildings, probably made of brick, with their own police stations, fire stations, hospitals, shops, power plant, reservoir lakes that they would use for their water supply, filtration units, everything you could think of. But the Hollywood idea of living in a bunker is like a tunnel or a tube or a cave network. Those are just the tunnels to get inside of these hollowed out mountains that could withstand EMPs and nuclear blasts. There's Mount Weather, 80 miles west of Washington, D.C., in Berryville, Virginia. The freestanding city also, with lakes and everything. It's also a freestanding city, hollowed out mountain. And the source of this is the U.S. National Archive and the book Raven Rock by Garrett Graff, and declassified documents by the U.S. military. Everyone knows of Cheyenne Mountain, NORAD, also a hollowed out mountain bunker with a city. Congress has their own bunker, believe it or not, even though they are not included in the COG plans. Remember, no elected officials besides the presidents. But the bunker at Greenbrier, West Virginia, is basically the crappiest of all. It's just an underground room complex that could withstand bombs of sorts. I don't know about bunker busters nowadays, modern bunker busters, but that's where they put Congress in there. And they kind of want Congress to survive on the surface and like lead the broken fallout nation. Like, this is really deep when you look at the lores in different various predictive programming movies and video games like the Fallout series. And Congress also isn't told about this because they rotate too often, too many elected, their terms are short. So they don't really get the key cards to access to the bunkers. They don't get told this plan because they don't want a big pool of ex-congressmen that know this information or have access to the codes, and they have to swap the codes out. Even the Federal Reserve has its own bunker at Mount Pony, Virginia. Room for the federal chair head and the board of governors, and also $400 billion in cash for all the nation's needs during the crisis, during nuclear fallout. I wonder if that bunker is still used today and how much money is in there, because the 400 billion number is from the 60s, and 400 billion in modern day money from the 60s is a lot more. Even the State Department has their own cattle research facility in Front Royal, Virginia, where they will retreat to and live out life on their bucolic ranch. Our entire modern system of life was formed by these doomsday policies, by the notion that we could survive nuclear apocalyptic war, and every agency would mold and transform after that. The United States Post Office was tasked with registering and cataloging the dead after a nuclear war or pandemic. You would show up at the refugee camps and you'd be handed a form 810 from the post office, a little postcard that you would fill out that says who died in your family, who survived, and the post office would be responsible for getting that information to the post-doomsday government. So the whole point of this is deeply seated into our nation. This prepper mentality. Preppers didn't start with the people. Preppers started with the government. And they did a really good job in the beginning of trying their hardest to save the population, building these fallout shelters, creating the biscuits, helping as much as they could for infrastructure underneath every post office, school, and courthouse in America. They tried their hardest to put on top of every flagpole, on top, in the ball up there, matches, a lighter, a survival kit for every American to know about. And they did a great job. They had their Operation Alert, and it was very, very overtly done, very publicly known that the entire government would practice evacuating. They all would retreat up to the bunkers. The people would be a part of it. The whole idea of all you had to do was duck and cover underneath your desk, and you'd be safe from nuclear war. And as technology grew and grew and got faster and stronger, and the response times got quicker and quicker, the government abandoned trying to save the populace and left us to fend for ourselves. They recommended building fallout shelters in your backyards. That was a popular thing back in the day. And the response times went from hours to minutes to seconds, and there were even rumors and stories that the Eisenhower-Kennedy era presidencies were certain that the Soviet embassy on 16th Street had an atomic bomb up in the attic, basically reducing warning time to 0. And who knows, with submarines off the coastlines and response times are quick, they really can't save everyone, not even everyone within government. We know from stories back in the 60s and 50s when this was started that there were offices and agencies, next door, the office next door, you wouldn't know what they were working on because this was the most classified information during the time, continuity of government. And quite literally, your neighboring office would be safe from catastrophe, but your office would not. You would have to stay and fend for yourselves. Every agency was involved with this, even down to the park rangers that were tasked to set up the refugee camps in the state and national parks, because they believed that the cities would be wiped out, but the wilderness areas would be left untouched. And you'd be greeted by your local park ranger to help greet you into the refugee camp. They even had park rangers tasked to save the Liberty Bell and get the Liberty Bell to the bunker in the event of a disaster, and to save certain relics of America. The government chose the Declaration of Independence over the Constitution of the United States of America. Even the IRS calculated and figured out means and ways to tax you after nuclear war. Of course they wouldn't stop. They tried to figure out how to tax nuclear damaged property. What category would that fall into? So the history of COG that you've just heard is comedic and funny now, but was taken very seriously back in the day. And the evolutions of this with technology have ramped up over the years, but went super speed with the Bush administrations and Donald Rumsfeld. And during 9/11 is the only time continuity of government was implemented that we know of. And next we will discuss this, the modern aspect of COG and where it leads to us now with different threats of terrorism, cyber attack, EMP, and how they shifted from evacuation plans to more about de-evolution and stopping situations in minor areas, like maybe DC becomes isolated from the rest of the nation and the rest of the nation has to operate without its leadership. Stuff like that is what we see today with COG. But they are operating behind the scenes as a shadow government. And we will discuss this on the next video, how COG affects the modern day of politics. Because once you understand these details, You're going to stop crying about Donald Trump, crying about the presidencies, and you're going to realize who really controls the government, who really controls the military and the evacuation plans of these people. Find out on the next video. Thank you very much for watching.